another episode of the Atlantic Still podcast. I'm your host, Donald Campbell, and I am here with Dan Solt. Did I say your last name right, Dan?
Solt, yes.
Solt, yes. Do you like Daniel or Dan?
Professionally, I have Daniel and everything, so
Okay, so I'll
that
go with
pops out more
Daniel.
now. Sure.
I'll go with Daniel. So we'll keep it professional. I don't want to get you in trouble by the unprofessional people, whoever they are. So Daniel is an attorney for South Jersey Legal Services, which is a great nonprofit legal service that serves. You guys obviously you guys serve South Jersey, but is that it? Is that your whole region, or like what are your service areas?
Yes, so our service area is all of South Jersey. We have an office in almost every county in South Jersey. We have a sister company, sister organization that's Legal Services of New Jersey, and they generally cover the northern counties. But my office specifically is in Atlantic City, and we deal with clients that are just in Atlantic County for my particular office.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about what is South Jersey Legal Services, who is eligible for services, and just give us a little background on the agency.
Sure. So in order to qualify for services through South Jersey Legal Services, you have to be either low income or a senior. A majority of our clients are low income as opposed to being seniors. So we do a whole variety of services. Landlord tenant, preventing evictions, wrongful evictions is the majority of the cases that we do. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's like 65% of our caseload is helping defend tenants from being wrongfully evicted, or providing legal advice to tenants that are being victims of domestic violence is something that I also specifically do. We advocate for clients that are trying to get entitlements from Atlantic County or the state of New Jersey or the federal government if they're having difficulties with that. We do some family law, like divorces, if they're uncontested or not super complicated. We do some of them. Pretty much anything that doesn't fall into the criminal world. There's a possibility that we'll do it. But our we do have a case acceptance schedule that dictates the type of cases that we're allowed to take. But I guess my point is someone has an issue that's not criminal in nature. And they're low income or a senior, it can't hurt to call our intake unit that's based out of Camden, let them know what the issue is, and find out whether you qualify for free legal advice or free legal representation.
Yes, and we'll definitely put the number to you guys in our description below. And are there specific intake hours? I know some nonprofits that I've worked with before that do legal services have specific intake hours. Is that true for South Jersey Legal?
It is, yeah. They're open 8:30 to 4:30, Monday through Friday. Regular business hours that office is open also.
Yes, and this is just for me, I gotta give, because I've helped some people with intakes. I always tell people, you don't have to tell your life story in the intake. It's just a brief description. You're just talking to an intake worker, and this is my tip for disability advocacy when I work with people who also have disabilities, and we call. Sometimes I always tell them that less is more. Sometimes there's a time to tell your whole story, but the intake worker does not need to know about all the breakdowns of your legal situation. So when you call, you're having a landlord tenant issue, and maybe some brief background and answer their questions, so they can see that you qualify. But I've been in that situation where I'm like, this is not the right arena to tell your whole story. I understand the urge to do it. People want to get their story out, and the people at South Jersey Legal and a lot of these nonprofits do want to listen and want to help, but to get the most efficient help possible, sometimes I'm like, you got to get right to the point and let them get you in the right direction, get you to somebody like Dan who can help you out with your situation. Am I right about that, Dan? You know what I mean? Sometimes
I agree completely. Yeah, the intake unit is, they're not there to give you legal advice. They're there to process you, to find out if you qualify for services and just put you in the right category. If a file is opened and you are assigned to an attorney, that's your opportunity to tell the whole story. So we hear everything.
Yeah,
I agree completely.
Exactly. So what do you do specifically? What are your areas? Do you do landlord tenant?
Yes.
Or do you have a
Yep.
specialty? Do you just do anything that kind of comes in and if it's in your area, you do it?
So our office is pretty large relative to some of the other ones. Like the Cape May County office is a smaller office. They have maybe 3 or 4 attorneys there. So they have to be less specialized because there's less attorneys. In my office, I think there's 12 attorneys right now, roughly some 11, 12, right around there. So we're all pretty specialized in what we do. 90% of my work right now is housing, working with tenants that are being evicted or they're having issues with their landlord. And the other 10% roughly is I'm doing domestic violence work. So we represent victims of domestic violence that have filed a TRO, a temporary restraining order, and that are looking to get a final restraining order against the defendant, the person who perpetrated the domestic violence.
Yes. Okay. And how long? So let's kind of back up. How did you get involved? How did you end up at South Jersey Legal? So for those of you that don't know, I met Dan. He called me. Um, we were out of the blue. He had he also is a professor at Stockton. He had a student come visit me. He was calling to see how that went, and he told me his story, and he told me that we had a lot in common. We both went to the same college and the same law school. Did you go to ACC too, or did you go right to Stockton?
No, I started at ACC.
Okay,
Yeah,
so I my joke is that I felt like and Dan has cerebral palsy as well that I have as well, and I felt like I was like the original person, and then I met Dan, and turns out he did it all before me. He was the trailblazer. So tell us how you got interested in the law and political science. Like, how'd you get here?
sure. I guess I'll start with my education at Stockton. I was a political science major there. And at some point, I was considering teaching like social studies or history. But I had the pre-law advisor at Stockton sit me down and talk to me about my future when I was getting close to graduating. And I said, hey, I might go to grad school. I might get a teaching certificate, which is like, was another year and a half or something like that. I had some of the law classes that Stockton offered, and I enjoyed them. I got good grades in them. And he said, have you ever considered going to law school? And I didn't have any lawyers in my family. I didn't really have any interaction with it at all. But the idea, I'm odd in the sense that I didn't have any real goal to become an attorney. I was more interested in the education, the challenge of going to law school. And as soon as he suggested, I said, you can go get a master's in 2 years, or you can go for 3 years and get a law degree. And probably, that might take you further in life. So I looked into it and, it started to pique my interest a little bit. So I decided to take the LSAT and apply to law school. I only applied to one school. A professor at Stockton said, hey, I think Widener at Delaware is what you're looking for. I didn't want to be in a big city. She's like, it's similar to the Mays Landing area. Um, it's smaller, nothing too crazy. So I applied there. I got in. And I still, even in law school, I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my degree. I wasn't still sure if I was going to be an attorney or not. I had a couple summer jobs at law firms or with the courts, and I enjoyed them. I got a judicial clerkship my first year out of law school, and that kind of set me on the road of actually being a real attorney once I passed the bar exam. So I never looked back. I've enjoyed all the jobs that I've had. I've had a variety of positions. I was in private practice for a while, right before starting with South Jersey Legal Services, which I've been there almost 2 years now. I was an attorney for Atlantic County. I was assistant county counsel there. I enjoyed that too. I generally enjoy government work or working for this nonprofit. I didn't enjoy private practice as much. I learned a lot at the firm I was at, but it just wasn't my thing. I enjoyed working for Atlantic County. But how I ended up at South Jersey Legal Services specifically was a good friend of mine through the Bar Association. When I first started practicing law, I was active in the Atlantic County Bar Association, and I became friends with an attorney that had been practicing a handful of years prior to me, and she became the managing attorney at the Atlantic City office. And she, enticed me to come work for South Jersey Legal Services, and all the good work that we do over there and helping people that are in need. And that's really the major thing, is that, every person that comes through our doors is a vulnerable person, whether they have a disability or whether they're very low income or for any number of reasons. They could be a victim of domestic violence, for example, and being able to help those people. And I I'm in court all the time. I'm not sitting behind a desk just doing paperwork all day, every day. I like being on my feet in front of a judge in the courtroom, and actually helping people. So it's been a good fit for me. I volunteered a lot since graduating law school in different aspects of the community, and this is just another way that you could be really involved in the community, really help people, and do good work.
Yeah, I can relate to a lot of that, and I think there's a lot of lessons in that, especially for people, and especially for people with disabilities. I get the question too, why do you, and even though I don't practice, but like, why do you work at a nonprofit? And a lot of it is like, because you can see the measurable impact of like helping people, whereas sometimes if you go somewhere else where maybe it's a little more money, you don't feel like you said, you feel like you're behind the desk all day. Like, I like the idea that I don't know what I'm walking into every day, even though it can be a little stressful. I like that, like, you're really helping somebody in a vulnerable situation. And I can really relate to that. Was it Professor Akiri who sat you down and asked you about the?
Yes.
Yes, because he did the same thing to me. I wonder how many times he did that. He was a great professor at Stockton, passed
Yes.
away a few years ago, and he was one of my favorites. And I do remember him coming up to me and being like, what are you doing after you graduate? And I was like, I don't know, I'm thinking about, I, like Dan, was thinking about my, master's degree, and he kind of did push me. I wonder how many people he pushed to law school, because but he really did believe in his students. And
Yeah.
Professor Linda Wharton is another great one who was a big help to me in getting where I was. I'm sure she did. Were those the classes you took at
Yeah. I
yeah,
swear we're almost the exact same person.
we pretty much are. So
Yeah.
I think I remember her speaking very highly of you. She was
Oh,
like, you gotta
good.
talk to this person named Dan. And I don't know if we ever connected, but because you were like graduating when I was starting, like that was, I think, like our timeline. So, but I just think it's important, because a lot of times I get asked by people with disabilities, like, how'd you get to where you are? I think what you talked about in like volunteering and going to the bar association in Atlantic County, like, it really is about networking. And sometimes you go to these things and you don't know how things are going to work out, and you're like, oh, this is a waste of time. But like, I got my job here at the center by first started out as a volunteer board member, and then opportunities opened up, and I became the director. But if I just said, oh, they're not paying me to volunteer, and just didn't do it, it would have never happened. Like, sometimes you have to put, if you show up enough, you get put to work eventually. So
I
how
agree.
did your, so I know you have cerebral palsy. How would you define your disability, and how did that affect your journey? Did it affect it at all? Because sometimes it doesn't.
Sure. Yeah. Not so much in my adult life. But when I was born, there were some complications with my mother at birth. And soon thereafter, they recognized that I had some physical deficiencies. I was very weak as a baby. At approximately right around 4 or 5 years old, I wasn't able to do a sit up. I couldn't sit up on my own, and very flexible, very flimsy. They recognized that I had some, like I said, some physical weakness and muscle tone and things like that. So I was diagnosed at a young age as having CP, very mild. My parents put me in martial arts to try and help strengthen me, my body, coordination, things like that. So at 5 years old, they put me in a Korean martial art, and I was there 3 nights a week until I was 13 years old. I attained my black belt at that age. I started to get bored with it after that many years, and I took a few years off, and then I went back when I was I think I was 17, and I went back on my own. And at that point I was paying my own way, and went for another 3 or 4 years. I was able to get my second degree black belt. But it was great for me physically. At that young age, it was instrumental in building muscle tone and helping with coordination and body control, and it really helped me be able to manage the symptoms that I had from CP. I was able to, through growing up, also start to play sports and things like that, and all of them were very helpful for me and helping maintain, um, the muscle issues that I was having, things like that. So luckily, my parents were recognized it at a young age, and were able to put me in different activities that helped alleviate some of those symptoms.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds great. Now, my parents also tried martial arts with me. It was not as successful as it was with you. Wasn't my thing. Still a big MMA fan, so I guess I got into it that way. So
I don't think we've talked about that yet, but it's shocking to me how similar we are. The
oh,
only
good.
sport that
Okay,
I
okay,
follow
good.
is
Good.
MMA.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Maybe it's like a CP
I don't know.
warrior thing. So we have that in common too. This is also just going to be a bonding podcast.
We
So
didn't
at
even
least,
know.
well, at least we'll have that. So you're also a professor at Stockton. Tell us a little bit about that and what you're teaching and how that's going.
Sure. Oh, that reminds me. I was supposed to do this at the beginning, but all of my opinions or anything I state here today are not on behalf of South Jersey Legal Services or Stockton University, just to cover myself and to cover them. I've always been interested in the law when it comes to disability law, disability rights, just because obviously I was diagnosed with CP. And as I said, I kind of early in college life was interested in teaching at some point. So after maybe 6 or 7 years of practicing law, I started to look around to see if I could teach part-time. I was checking out ACC's website. I was checking out Stockton's website for job postings, trying to find something that I thought I was capable of teaching, that I had the skill set to teach. A friend of mine works at I never get their name right. Whatever Stockton's disability accommodations
Oh,
unit is
I
called.
got it. I got it for you, Dan. The Learning Access
There you go.
Program. The Learning
Yes, they're
Access.
learning. So my friend, who I've known for a very long time, works there, and she's also an adjunct professor. And I just happened to be hanging out with her one weekend. Her kids were actually getting swim lessons at a pool I help run in Northfield. And I told her, I was like, randomly said, hey, I've been checking Stockton's HR website, once a week for the last 6 months or 9 months or whatever it had been at that point, because I was looking to get an adjunct position. And she said that they just had a meeting recently, and they because Stockton has a minor program called disability studies, and they did not have anyone teaching kind of contemporary disability law. And she asked me if that was something that I had done or had any experience with, and I dabbled in it in a variety of ways. There's no real attorney, at least not in our area that I'm aware of, that just practices disability law. It's
Right.
not really
Right.
a thing.
It's not really a thing. Yep. You're
Yeah,
exactly right.
attorneys, they do employment law, and with that comes some disability law, or they do education law, and with that comes some disability law. And I do housing law now, and with that comes some disability law. So I've done a variety of disability law through other aspects of practicing law. And I said, sure. And I'm not teaching to law students. I'm teaching to undergrad students. So there's definitely a level there that, it's not, I don't have to be such a high level that I'm teaching, like
Right.
law students, right? So I said, certainly, I'm capable of doing that. And where I'm deficient in certain areas, I can certainly read up on the case law and do whatever I needed to do. So I put together a presentation, presented to other professors and some deans or department heads or whatever they were. I presented this course called Disability Law, Past, Present, and Future, and the class was accepted. So I teach the history of the disability rights movement to start, and then I teach contemporary disability law in all of the main areas, like, as I mentioned, education, employment, government services, telecommunications, all of those things. And then we look into the future. What's the future of disability rights and disability law? And that's how we kind of wrap up the semester. So it's been pretty successful so far.
That I wish I could take that class, but after going through law, after going through all the years of school we go through, like I remember saying, I'm never going back to any school again. But that would be the type of class I would be interested in. So, I don't want to give your whole class away, but where are we? You could just give us like a brief thing of where would you say we are with disability law, and where do you think, like you said, where is the future going? What's kind of the next step?
Sure. The future is the most interesting part. Where we're at right now, the ADA had such a huge impact on disability rights. That was 1990. It's been a while since then. There hasn't really been any major legislation impacting disability rights since then. A couple things here and there, but nothing at the scope that the ADA had. And that was it was very impactful. I'm not going to minimize how important the ADA was, but it was kind of a floor, not a ceiling. It's like these are the
Yes.
minimum standards, right? So I think lawsuits and case law have been building on that over the last 30, whatever, 32, 33 years, however many years it's been. And that's been helpful, but there's still some areas that are behind the times. And it's not terrible, but it's not great either. Things are improving little by little, but it's not where it could be, certainly. I teach my students that, there's two aspects to disability rights. One is the law, like what the law is and what court cases say, that side of things. But the other side, and just as important, is the social side. We could have all the greatest laws in the world, but if society doesn't accept people, people with disabilities, if there's still prejudice, if there's still issues, with society accepting people that have disabilities, then that's half the battle, right? So there's two fronts that need to continue to improve on. One is the social side. That's why I love teaching at Stockton. I have the opportunity to teach these students, 18 to 21 normally, about disability rights, disability law, and really help make clear to them that it's important for them to treat people that have disabilities as they would want to be treated, right? As a as a
Yes.
as a baseline. So we talk about the whole social side, we talk about the law side, and I think every one of my students leaves my class at the end of the semester with a much stronger understanding of what disability rights means and what the law is in certain areas that we cover. And I feel good about at the end of the semester that these students are walking away with an understanding and hopefully an acceptance, and will become advocates themselves in any job that they have or anything that they do, later on in life.
Yeah,
I
I
think it's
think
important.
I think that's so much of what you said. I just nod my head in agreement. The ADA, I think part of the issue is people thought we passed the ADA and it was like over, like, okay, everybody with disability is good and they're fine now and they're all gonna run out and get jobs, which a lot of them did. And you and I are, and a lot of people are testaments to the ADA. So I don't want to act like it didn't work. I mean, the idea of people with disabilities practicing law was a radical idea until the 90s and stuff like that. So it did work, but it didn't address a lot. Like you said, it doesn't address the social issues. You got to enforce the ADA, which is very difficult. I hear stories all the time of people being discriminated against where they might have a potential lawsuit. Served one recently yesterday, but I understand why sometimes you don't push it. Sometimes you're like, you know what, I'm just not gonna. Somebody, doesn't accommodate you in an interview, and you could have an ADA case on that, and but sometimes you're just like, you know what, I just won't take that job. Like, what am I gonna do? Fight this case, get this job where these people obviously don't want me here? So
Right.
it's that makes it difficult. Also, it doesn't address a lot of the systemic barriers that exist, like people ask me all the time, why don't people with disabilities work? Well, as you know, who does because of your work, helping people get entitlements, like you can't make a lot of income if you're on SSI, even SSDI, Social Security income and Social Security disability. So it becomes a disincentive to work. And that's just one of the things that keep, a lot of people's benefits are tied up in their income. So when you look at people with disabilities and say, why aren't they working? A lot of times they would like to work, but it doesn't make sense for them to work because all their benefits are tied up in their income. So I think that's kind of the next step in disability rights. And there's been some progress in that area, but a lot more that needs to be done. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or have seen that as kind of the next step.
Yeah, you reminded me about the whole future side of disability and disability law. But specific to that, I agree. It is a problem that many people who have disabilities and that are getting benefits, are almost penalized if they, get a job or work too many hours.
get
And
married if you're on SSI and you get
yeah,
married to somebody else on S, then your income gets counted as one. It becomes
yeah,
very difficult. And that,
it is a problem. I think it's recognized as an issue, and I'm hoping that we're heading in the right direction of being able to resolve that issue or at least make it better. But I wanted to mention a major part of the future that the future of disability rights, disability law that I teach has to do with genetics. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with CRISPR technology.
no,
It is
explain.
okay. So, I don't know exactly when it was invented or created, but I know over the last 5 years or so, there's been a significant increase in the exposure of this technology. And I'm no scientist, obviously, but my understanding of it is that there's newer technology that allows scientists to repair damaged DNA or take out certain. It's almost like it reminds me of Jurassic Park. You know how they
Yes.
find dino DNA and then they kind of put some
And that
frog
ended
DNA in there.
that ended well, Dan. So I'm good with going down that route.
But it's that it is similar in a way, much more intricate these days, but it allows so we talk I start and I teach this spectrum of there's many diseases out there. I'll use cancer, right? The biggest one that no one really is going to argue we shouldn't cure cancer, we shouldn't fix cancer. CRISPR technology, I think any scientist that's involved in that would agree that at some point in the very near future that the technology exists that they're going to be able to cure many types of cancer, if not all types of cancer. And then we take it to the next step of, okay, well, cancer is a deadly disease a lot of times. What about diseases that aren't deadly? And then that the final step somewhere down that spectrum is, do we create all children that have blonde hair and blue eyes? That
Yeah.
stereotypical 6'2" men, all muscular, great athletic, builds. This technology certainly has the ability to do that. So it's exciting in the sense that it could cure a lot of serious, deadly diseases, but it could also result in many social issues. And how that ties in with disability rights and disability law is, our technology now allows for a lot of disabilities to be recognized in the uterus phase, or in the embryo phase, in utero. And there are countries in Europe, Scandinavian countries, mostly right now, where children that have Down syndrome are not being born. They're identifying it prior to birth. And, through CRISPR technology, they have the ability to repair the genetic issues. And at some point, that potentially is going to be applicable to all disabilities, that are obviously through birth, as opposed to losing a limb later on in life. And we have a conversation in my class. Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? There could be arguments on both sides of that, but diversity in a world is a good thing,
Yes.
and disabilities offer diversity. And many people that have disabilities will say, I'm perfectly fine with my disability. I'm living a good life. Like, it's fine. I wouldn't want it any other way. And to get rid of that disability prior to birth, because the parent is making, the mother or father is making that decision, there's a whole conversation to be had about that and the ethics of that. And the technology is still new. So, if a mother has a change made to their child in utero, and then that child's born without a disability, what is the next generation? What's the impact on the next generation? So it's fascinating because there's so many different roads you could go down with this technology, but we try and focus on, it could very well eliminate many disabilities. And is that a good thing or a bad thing for society? I try and encourage, we have an open discussion about that to see where we're going with that. And the
Yeah,
technology is there now.
that's a great topic, and like we're going real deep on the podcast, real asking the big questions, because you're right, there are such positives and negatives on both sides. Like, to be able to rid the world of such serious disabilities would be a good thing. On the negative side would be, I think one of the big movement of the disability rights movement is just getting people to accept like disability as a normal part of human nature. That's why like I'm not a big fan of when people use different words to say disability. Like I don't like when people say differently abled or dis the ability or whatever. Like because and this is just my opinion. I think disability. We want to see disability. It's just a part of life. Like you just have to. We have to accommodate it and support it and let people live their full potential with it and not try to hide it. And what happens to the people? What happens to that movement if people can just avoid that part of life? What happens to that support if people can just avoid that part of life? Or what happens to the people who choose not to get that cure, for lack of a better word? Like,
Sure.
do they get isolated? Do they have the support? Are they looked down upon? Are they shunned? But again, on the positive, like this is again competing values. Like, how are you going to tell somebody not to do that? Like, it's their life, it's their body. I'm supposed to tell you, oh, you were born with this disability, they have a cure, you shouldn't take it because I don't know, because I don't think you should. Like, that's not really what disability rights is about either. It's all about choices and freedom and your ability to live your life. So I love that you're thinking about that. You're getting people to think about that because you know it's like all these great inventions. They're like a tool, and they open so many good things and so many potential negative consequences. I think it's really important we think it through. I know that one of the questions I have always gotten growing up, and this is like on the list of annoying questions that people ask people with disabilities, is if they could cure it, would you? And I don't
Right.
really know how to answer that because I don't know my life any better. Like I don't know what my life would be like, but at the same time, I've never really had that option. So what would people's life look like? Like if somebody said take this pill and your CP would go away, I don't know what I would do, and that's just being honest.
Mhm.
So um I just think that's a really good thing, and I hope your college students are a little freaked out about that when they're thinking about it. So
Yeah, it's a big topic, right? There's a lot of things to talk about, and we only scratched the surface of that debate. But many many of them are interested because there's an anti-aging aspect to CRISPR technology at some point,
yes,
and we could go down that road and have an hour-long conversation too about how that impacts society. But I try and keep it focused on disability rights so that we take a hard look at where is our society going? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Just like you said, that's a big question, and I think it's an individual question. If everyone's going to answer that a little bit differently, if they have a disability and if they were given a pill saying you can get rid of your disability, or would you make that choice? That's a tough one.
yeah, I think it's a tough question, and I think everybody who says I know the definite answer is lying to themselves because one again we right now we it's still mostly theoretical, although you listed some examples in your where it's starting. Like people you probably used to think, oh, I don't need a phone to be with me all the time. I have a phone at home, that's enough. But now people it's becomes a part of the culture. Now, there was just a point in my life where it was like if you didn't have a phone, it was like you felt like you were missing something. So I just think that's true. I know we're bouncing around a lot of things. What do you think are, from a legal perspective? So one of the questions I get about all the time, because we're a center for independent living, is landlord tenant law. Like that's like a number one question I get. So what do you think the biggest challenges are for people with disabilities in housing in this state? Like I know that I always say it's the hardest thing that we help people with because there's not enough of it and people don't understand why. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
You said there's not enough of it. Do you mean just housing in general?
Yeah, and like
Yeah.
affordable housing in general.
Yes, I agree. I completely agree, especially since the pandemic. Last year, I saw at some point, probably in the summertime, a statistic that NJ.com put out that said um, rental rates went up 33% in just that 1 year alone. And that is significant because certainly salaries are not going up that much, and that drastically impacts low income people who more often than not are renters. There's no easy answer as to how to fix the problem of a lack of affordable housing, a lot of lack of affordable rental units. But it is a serious problem. I have so many clients over the last year and a half or so who have Section 8 vouchers. They qualified, they were approved, means they're obviously pretty low income at that point, and the government is subsidizing their rent. And for one reason or another, they were moving on from the rental unit they were in and having to find a new rental unit. And because rent rates were so high in that year, that year and a half jump, that they're not getting approved by Section 8 for a new rental unit. For example, it's kind of a math issue. If you have a Section 8 voucher, you're allowed to rent a unit for X amount of dollars, and they'll pay X amount of dollars through the voucher. And you can go up, like, I think it's 30% above, portion of your income that you can apply above what the voucher pays for. And every rental unit that dozens and dozens of rental units that my clients were looking at and trying to rent were all being denied by Section 8 as being above that limit. And I had clients lose their Section 8 voucher because they have a certain amount of time to find a new rental unit before they lose their voucher,
Right.
normally 60 days, and then you can get an extension or two. But, they were getting multiple extensions, not being able to find any housing, and losing their Section 8 voucher because there's such a lack of affordable housing in our area. And that's devastating to them. That's a lifelong a benefit that they could have as long as they stay qualified, and they're losing it because they simply cannot find alternate rental unit within their budget. It's a major problem.
Yeah, I
Specifically,
agree.
luckily, I get about 30 files assigned to me every month. Mostly, 28 or 29 of them would be housing files every month. And it is very rare, luckily, that I see a issue related specifically to a disability law. We do, I see emotional support animals, I see service animals, sometimes issues related to that. I see some access issues, providing, proper access, curb cuts, things like that on occasion. But I think that's a good indication that our area is pretty compliant with the disability laws when it comes to housing. But we get housing cases where it's strictly a disability rights issue, disability law issue, and we strongly advocate on behalf of those people. It's
Yeah,
lucky
and
that we have that.
New Jersey is a pretty strong state, even with landlord tenant. I think people don't appreciate sometimes that our tenant protections are pretty strong comparatively to other states, which is, I'll give my disclaimer to my people with disabilities. Sometimes they move. People can live whatever they want. It's a great part of the country, but make sure you check in with the laws and what services are out there, because not every state is the same. New Jersey is not Texas. New Jersey is not Florida. That's not me judging anybody. Just know what you're getting into, because sometimes I have people who call and say, I'm gonna move here, and I'm like, that's great, but just make sure you know where your Medicaid's gonna go, and where your landlord tenant law is, and try to get an idea of that, because not every place is the same. Also, what you said about there not being enough housing, people ask me why that is all the time, and I said the truth is, the constituency for more affordable housing is not that powerful. So there's a lot of people are for affordable housing, just as long as it's not in their backyard, like as long as it's over there in the town over or in the city next to them. So it would really help if, like, there is room to build housing, and there is money to build housing. I know this great organization called Project Freedom, who they do great housing for people with disabilities. It's all accessible, and they can do it, but they need a place to do it. They need all the approvals, they need the town to sign on, they need the stuff to sign on, and that's not easy to get. And the people who are against this stuff, because they don't want the people or the traffic or whatever, they don't want their idea of their town to change, they show up to those meetings, they show up to those city council meetings, they show up to
Yes.
those town halls. So I would advise people with disabilities to really, I know it's tough, but if all the people with disabilities who need this stuff banded together and showed up to those meetings, it would be a lot easier to get these things done. So I think sometimes people don't see how the system is. That's why it is. It's not the only reason, but it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. I remember watching, wasn't in New Jersey, but it was housing, and the people didn't want that housing there, and it was just like an empty area, like a parking lot, and they were protesting, we don't want this housing development, here, because they just didn't want it, but for all kinds of reasons. But I just want people to know that's what would help places like the Center and Disability Rights and South Jersey Legal help you out more, because we can't. I always say, when people call, we can't pull housing out of the sky despite our
Right.
best efforts. So,
One of the projects I give to my students every semester, which is the assignment is that they have to go and interview someone that works in a disability rights, advocacy center of any number of units throughout Atlantic County. Actually, it could be anywhere in the state, because some of my students are from North Jersey and they go home, periodically. So on occasion, I'll get a advocacy organization from outside of Atlantic County, but you know way too often when they come back and report they do a presentation in class to tell the other students what they learned about that particular advocacy group. So my students learn about all the different aspects of all the different opportunities that are out there, such as your organization and many others. But my point is, way too often the students come back and report that one of the major issues is that there's not enough housing for the group of disabled people that they represent and that they advocate for. And it's disheartening that it's the same thing all through South Jersey, that every organization that's trying to provide some type of service to people with disabilities, one of their number one complaints is that there's a lack of affordable housing and services related to housing. It's a serious problem.
yeah, it is. And we could talk forever, but you did touch on a topic, and then I know you probably have a life you have to get back to. But I just got a question about this thing you just brought it up, so I wanted to talk about it. Emotional support animals. What is the rule? What are the rules? What are landlords allowed to ask? Are they allowed to charge you a fee? Are you required to register? I get those questions all the time, and one of the things I love about the podcast is I can direct people to these episodes and they can get the answer. So what would you advise people? What are the parameters? What are the rules?
Sure. Now, do you want me to keep it strictly to housing?
Uh yeah, keep it to housing. Keep it to
Okay,
housing.
sure. So I guess as a starting point, we got to recognize that there's a major difference between a service animal and an emotional support animal. A service animal there's strong protections for service animals. The stereotypical example is a seeing eye dog, right? Service animals are almost always dogs. 99.9% of the time it's going to be a dog, and there's strong rights. They can go anywhere, almost anywhere. You can't prevent them from going in restaurants, or you can't prevent them if someone wants to rent a unit and the advertising says no pets. That does not apply to a service animal at all.
Because
They
they're
are
not a
protected.
pet under the law. They're service animals.
Right, right. So they have to be a trained service animal. They have to be trained to perform a particular task, and obviously the owner has to have a disability of some type. Outside of service animals, looking strictly at emotional support animals, the major difference between them is they are not trained to do a particular task. Um, Generally, it's a person who may have a disability or may have an emotional issue, anxiety. They have to be being treated by a physician or a professional for some issue. So stereotypically, let's say it's someone who has anxiety and we'll keep it we'll keep it with a dog. Their dog alleviates those symptoms. The dog isn't trained to alleviate those symptoms, but just having the dog in that, around that person, it alleviates their symptoms. It's certainly helping with their issue. Um, so in housing, you have to notify the landlord that you have an emotional support animal, and you should provide them with documentation that you're being treated by a professional, and that document should say they're being treated, and the emotional support animal alleviates the symptoms of whatever it is that they're being treated for. Now, it's not like a service animal where there's a guarantee that the landlord can't say no. The landlord can say no, but the burden is then on the landlord to prove why it's a burden, why there is some major issue with allowing that dog or that cat or whatever the animal may be in the rental unit. And if the landlord cannot convince a judge, if it got that far, that there is this undue burden on the landlord, then the tenant is going to be successful with being able to keep that animal. Now, if it is a dog and that dog is barking all the time or lunges at, other tenants or some negative behavior, then there's a good chance that a judge would rule that the tenant cannot keep that emotional support animal. But if it is just a landlord that's worried about the dog peeing on the carpet, but there's no evidence of that, or is worried about, these hypothetical scenarios of I don't want the dog because it might do this or it might do that,
Yeah,
that's not going to meet that burden. A judge is going to
gotta
rule
be,
in favor of the tenant.
it's gotta be concrete. So what are the rules? It doesn't have to be a dog for emotional support. Could be a cat or something, or really anything, but I'm sure that again, and these are the answers that people love from lawyers, which is like it depends on the situation. Like if you're bringing an alligator and calling it your emotional support animal, like the tenant's probably going to win that case. I mean,
Yeah, so the
the
landlord,
landlord's probably going to win that case. So,
yeah, he would definitely have a stronger argument. He or she, the landlord, would definitely have a stronger argument if it was an alligator. But sure, there's no restriction. It could be any type of animal. But again, the more common, the more domesticated the animal is,
right,
then
improves
I
your
would I would
chances.
probably category of that a domesticated animal, which I don't think an alligator falls in that, is likely. If the landlord cannot prove the burden, then
Right.
the tenant is likely to be successful with that.
Right. Is there a limit on the number? Sometimes I get that question. Is there a limit on the number?
Yeah, there's no easy answer to that. I get that question sometimes too. And, unfortunately, I wish I could say, yeah, you can have five, but at some point, you're starting to strengthen the argument of the
Right.
landlord that there's a burden. One dog is easy to argue for, five dogs is way more difficult to argue that that's reasonable and that there's not going to be a burden on the landlord. So, no, there's no easy answer to that. It depends on situation, but each added animal weakens the argument of the tenant that it's necessary.
Right. Yeah, I always tell people look at it as like objectively reasonable.
Yeah.
But it's sometimes hard for my consumers and people to hear because all five of their cats are very special to them and
Yeah,
help them with their anxiety. And I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying, like you probably say all the time, you don't make the rules. You're just trying to help them. you know,
exactly.
get through them. So the other question I get, and you're really going through them and explaining in a clear way, is the landlord allowed to charge you extra rent or an extra security deposit or fee for your support animal?
Yeah. So service animal, no, but you're specifically asking about a an emotional support animal. So yes and no. There's a restriction on what you're allowed to have for a security deposit. It's 1.5 months rent. You cannot have anything more than that as a security deposit. We see many landlords wanting to charge a pet fee security deposit, like something like that. They don't call it a security deposit because they know they're trying to skirt that 1.5 months. But I've seen landlords try to get like almost another month's rent for a pet deposit. And that is a violation of New Jersey law.
Right.
The pet
Even for
deposit,
support. Even for support.
yes. No matter what they call it, if it's in the world of a security deposit to protect the landlord from damages or something like that, it can only be 1.5 months. So there, hypothetically, if they say, we're only going to take 1 month rent for a security deposit and a half a month rent for the pet deposit, that's fine. They can call it that as long as it does not get over 1.5 months.
Uh,
Landlords can charge a pet fee, a monthly pet fee. I've seen that if they're charging an extra $10 a month or $20 a month in rent for the pet, that's perfectly fine. It's not a security deposit, it's additional rent, it can be called. But again, for a trained service animal, they cannot do that.
So I just want to be clear to people. But for a support animal, they can charge a pet fee for a support animal.
So yeah, what I often see is tenants either don't tell their landlord when they're moving in that they have an emotional support pet, and then notify them at some later date, or the landlord finds out about it, and that's where our office gets involved because it kind of stirs up a mess. Or they start to have an issue or become disabled after already residing in this rental unit for a period of time, and then require an emotional support animal, or or their doctor may suggest it, or the treating therapist, or whoever it may be. At that point, then landlords, if you provide the proper documentation and you have a note from a doctor or a treating therapist or a professional, and you go to your landlord and you say, hey, I have an emotional support animal now. Here's my note. The burden then, as I said, the burden's on the landlord at that point to prove that there is an issue and try to, to get the animal out of there. No, if they wanted to at that point charge an extra fee, no, that would not be acceptable. But
Right,
just a
right,
blanket statement, if a lease says it's X amount of dollars per, like, a form lease that they use for everyone, X amount of dollars in rent per month. If you have a dog, we allow dogs under 30 pounds or whatever it may be, and it's going to be this much extra. That's okay in New Jersey, as long as it's not a trained service animal.
right,
But
right.
again, if they want to charge an extra amount, once they find out that the person has an emotional support pet, that would not be acceptable.
That's not acceptable either. So, that's where that documentation comes in and you highlight it, because sometimes I get the question, does it have to be my doctor? And it doesn't. It can be it could be your therapist, it could be
Correct.
anyone treating you, but that documentation comes in. So if you just have, your dog there and the landlord walks in and it's like, well, you never told me about the dog, and you have no documentation, even though it may be your emotional support dog, the landlord, I think, has a better case to say, no, this is just a regular pet. I have my $20 pet fee and that's what it is. But if you come in, you are a tenant, you come in and you say, here's my documentation and here's my emotional support dog, then that's waived. That's what I hear you saying. And I think that was
Yes,
real clear for
it
people.
is. Unfortunately, a lot of times a landlord finds out about a dog or dogs, then the tenant goes out to try and get the letter from a therapist or something. That's backwards. That certainly doesn't
Yes.
help the tenant. It might ultimately be successful, but it causes a lot of drama, right?
Well, yeah,
So
and the
yeah,
landlord has a better argument to say, wait a
yes,
minute, like this dog's been living here for 3 months. I didn't know about it. Now it's an emotional, support dog. And maybe you'll get, and this is what people, and I know you know this better than I do because you practice and I don't. Like it all depends at that point, it all depends on what judge you go before and like what anyone, the specifics of the situation. So I don't know how that would turn out for you, but my advice is, as soon as you feel like that animal is your emotional support, you should document that out right away. And I would inform your landlord. A lot of people think it's better to do this stuff under the radar, but if you got your ducks in a row, it's better that they know. And the sooner you say it, the better. Your argument was like, no, I walked in there. They were aware. They rented to me. I told them this was my emotional support dog. Now they're coming in and telling me, I'm gonna, this pet is, there's a $60 fee. Then Dan's like, okay, I can represent you, and
yeah.
the facts are on my side here. But the hiding thing, it never goes well for me.
A landlord can go in a rental unit with reasonable notice at any point to inspect it. So have it, it's got to be stressful if you're owner of a pet that it's not really supposed to be there, to always be worried about your landlord showing up or finding out.
Right, right. And I always say the word I use sometimes is you're giving the other side ammunition when you do that stuff. I don't know if it's gonna work out for you negatively, but you're strengthening, you think you're helping your case by hiding it, and but it's actually helping theirs, because it's like, well, if because if I'm a judge, I could say, well, if this is such an important emotional support pet, why didn't they inform the landlord right away? Why wouldn't they run around telling everybody, about it? So,
Yeah.
so I just think that's really important part of advocacy is sometimes just being clear. What do you need? So
Yes.
it's better that way. And I get that question a lot because people could be behind on rent and all this stuff, but they're not giving up their pets. or their support. So I get that question a lot. I'm glad you brought clarity. And I'm gonna just ask if you had anything in closing. This was such a wide-ranging conversation. You're real easy to talk to. Like I said, we have a lot in common. It's a shame we like missed each other, like because we could have bonded over CP and law and stress about law school. Would you here? I'll give you this final question. What would you say to somebody? Because I get this question too. Would you advise somebody to go to law school? Like, what would your advice be for somebody to go to law school? Because I have my thoughts on this, and I'm curious to see what yours are.
Sure. Law school for most people is a major financial burden, right? There's X amount of dollars that are involved for most people if they're going to go to law school. They may already have undergraduate debt. I went to Stockton part-time. I worked my way through, so I was lucky to be able to graduate Stockton without any undergraduate debt. I worked hard to be able to do that. So I only had law school debt at the end of law school, and it's still impactful, right? It
That's
certainly.
enough.
So what I say is, if you have a very strong desire to go to law school, if you really know you're passionate about it, and you're ready to make that commitment financially, you're ready to make that commitment in your life. It's a life-changing commitment, right? For 3 years, you've got to, really put your head down and grind your way through law school to be successful. Then I encourage someone to pursue that passion. If someone isn't passionate about it and isn't sure that it's really what they want to do, and they don't have the financial security, and it's going to be a financial burden on them, then I tell them that they really need to take a step back and think about the decision, and if they want to commit that time, that energy, and the money to something that it might not be their passion, it might not be something that they really desire to do.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
in a nutshell, if that's what they want to do and they're really passionate about it, yes. Otherwise, think about it.
Yeah, and I'll just echo this. It's like a big commitment, so don't just do it because you've been told your whole life that you be a good lawyer because you like to argue. Like,
Yes, I
like,
hear that a lot.
it's first of all, like that's not all of law school is running around arguing with people. It's a lot of writing and reading and work. And it's just, if you make that commitment, like it starts in undergrad, your grades have to be good. You have to do well on the LSAT. You have to research what school is best for you. It can be competitive. So you're going to feel the pressure of that. There's going to be financial issues. There's just a lot to think about. And I loved going to law school. It was hard, but like, I was like, I'm glad I did it, but I don't want anyone to do it just because they feel like they have to, because you don't. Like, you can find a career doing a lot of things. Not that a law degree doesn't come in handy. It does, but it's not a guarantee to being like a millionaire, which some people think. It's not an easy road. Those 3 years in law school, and even in undergrad, like I will say, that's when, because you're not, your friends could be taking easier classes than you, and you got to get over the fact that, like, I don't know how yours was, but like my last 2 years of Stockton were pretty intense because I was taking a lot of pre-law stuff and I had to study for the LSAT, and it was a lot. And you have to do well on the LSAT to get into a law school, even for Widener, which is a great more school for people. It's not, it's not Harvard. You don't have to get a terribly high score on the LSAT, but you do have to get a decent score to get in. So, and then you want to get as high as you want so you can get scholarships and money. So it's just a lot, and it's a great path if you want to take it, but don't let anyone pressure you. Because once you start down that road too, it can be hard to pull out and get out of it. So sometimes Professor Wharton has me come in and talk to her intro to law classes, and I'm always like, try to be realistic, like you just were, Dan. Like, don't do it just because you think you want to do it. You really do have to know. And that doesn't mean you have to know like your freshman year of college. And that's why it's great to take those pre-law classes. But when I hear like things like, well, I like to argue, but I don't really like to write. I'm like, okay, all right. I don't really like to do research or citations. I'm like, oh, all right, well, that's like, 75% of it. And, is studying for the bar stressful? Yeah.
Probably the
So
most stressful thing in your life.
yes, yes. Yes, and it will be your life. It does take over a big chunk of your life, and you have to be ready for that. So thank you so much, Dan, for doing this. You were a great guest, and I'm sure I'll have you again on to talk about other things because there's so much other things we can talk to. We can do a whole thing on UFC and educate people on that. But I don't know
Yeah.
how I would tie that into disability rights. So
It doesn't
I'll
matter.
find
We would enjoy it.
I'll find some way to do it. All right, Dan. Thank you.
That was a pleasure coming on. I appreciate it. Thanks for
All
inviting
right,
me.
bye everybody. See you next time.